It starts in a luxury restaurant glittering with chandeliers, where power wears a smile and cruelty hides behind expensive suits. A pregnant woman whispers for mercy after her husband kicks her under the table, his pride louder than her pain. But what he doesn't know is that a quiet stranger at the bar is watching every move. He isn't just any man. He's an undercover billionaire who has the power to turn this moment of abuse into a storm of justice. What follows is a story of arrogance, courage, and redemption that will shake everything this man built. Stay with me to the end, because you won't believe how it all unfolds. Let us know what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from, and drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The soft hum of jazz floated through the dining hall of the Velvet Table, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. Gold chandeliers glittered like captured stars, scattering their reflections across the glassware and polished marble floors. Waiters in crisp black vests glided between tables carrying bottles of vintage wine and plates of seared salmon, their movements rehearsed and graceful. It was the kind of place where conversation stayed low, laughter was refined, and everyone pretended their lives were perfect. At table 14, perfection had already begun to crack. Clara Hayes sat with her hands folded in her lap, her wedding ring catching the light. She was 7 months pregnant, dressed in a pale blue silk dress that barely fit her growing figure. Her face, once radiant with calm confidence, now looked drawn and pale. The man sitting across from her, Daniel Hayes, her husband, wore the tailored navy suit of a man who believed the world belonged to him. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the music. "Give me the phone, Clara," he said without looking up from his steak. Her fingers tightened slightly around her clutch. She didn't answer. Her heart was beating faster than the ticking of the wall clock behind her. Daniel looked up slowly. His blue eyes were steady, cold, and irritated, as if her silence was a personal offense. "Don't make me ask again. I know you've been texting someone." Clara's throat felt dry. She had spent years learning how to read the edges of his temper, the quiet before the storm. "I was just messaging my doctor. About the vitamins," she said softly. He laughed under his breath, a bitter sound that made the couple at the next table glance over. Lying again. "Do you think I'm stupid?" The restaurant's polished calm continued around them, but something invisible shifted in the air. The waiters avoided looking in their direction. The woman at the neighboring table whispered something to her husband, who nudged her to stay quiet. Clara's trembling fingers reached for her water glass. She wanted to diffuse the tension, to say something that might ease the sharpness in his tone, but the words never came. Daniel leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You embarrass me, Clara. You sit there like some innocent saint while people think I mistreat you. You love making me look bad, don't you?" She shook her head quickly, terrified of his anger flaring in public. "No. Daniel, please, I just—" "Enough," he hissed. His leg moved under the table. A sudden, violent kick struck her shin. The pain shot upward through her body, making her gasp out loud. Her fork fell onto the plate with a sharp clang that echoed across the room. For a moment, the entire restaurant froze. The piano stopped. A waiter turned his head. Someone's wineglass tilted dangerously before being caught midair. Clara's eyes widened in shock. She could barely breathe. Her hand instinctively went to her belly. The baby shifted inside, startled by the jolt of her mother's heartbeat. Tears filled her eyes. Her voice broke as she whispered, trembling, "Don't kick me again, please." The silence that followed was suffocating. Dozens of eyes turned toward them. Daniel, realizing the sudden attention, leaned back in his chair and adjusted his cufflinks, pretending nothing had happened. "She's fine," he said to no one in particular, forcing a small laugh. "It's just hormones. You know how it is." A couple at the next table exchanged looks of disgust. Someone's phone camera glowed faintly as they began recording, pretending to check their messages. Clara's face burned with shame. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the chair and never be seen again. But she couldn't move. The pain in her leg throbbed with every heartbeat. Daniel signaled the waiter. "We're ready for the check." His tone was dismissive, the same tone he used with his employees when he wanted them to remember their place. The waiter hesitated. He had seen everything. Everyone had. "Sir," the young man said quietly, "maybe we could—" Daniel's head snapped up. "Are you questioning me?" His voice rose slightly, enough for the entire section to hear. "Do your job and bring me the bill." The waiter swallowed hard and walked away. The air was so tense it felt breakable. Across the room, a man in a simple black jacket watched the scene unfold. He had been sitting alone at the bar, quietly sipping water while pretending to check his phone. His expression didn't change, but his eyes stayed locked on the couple. Daniel leaned closer to Clara again, his whisper venomous this time. "You made me look like a monster. Smile now, so people stop staring." Clara blinked away her tears, trying to force her lips into a weak smile. Her vision blurred, the chandelier lights merging into soft halos of gold. Her mind screamed for a way out, for help, for someone to step forward, but no one moved, no one dared. Then, from the reflection in the restaurant's mirrored wall, she noticed the man in the black jacket rise slowly from his seat. He placed his phone on the counter and whispered something to the bartender. Daniel was too busy checking his watch to notice. The low murmur of the restaurant resumed, but a sense of unease rippled through the air, invisible yet heavy. Clara's trembling hand rested protectively on her belly. Inside her, life moved. A faint kick, a reminder that she wasn't entirely alone. Her breath hitched, her body still shaking. The taste of salt and fear lingered on her lips. The moment stretched endlessly, like a photograph trapped between heartbeats. And as the sound of the waiter's approaching footsteps mixed with the soft murmur of voices, one thought kept echoing in her mind. "Please, God, let this end." The restaurant had never been this silent before. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. The soft clinking of glass, the laughter, the background music, all of it had vanished in a single instant. Clara's gasp still hung in the air like a haunting echo. She sat frozen in her chair, one hand gripping the edge of the table, the other clutching her swollen belly. Her face was pale, almost translucent under the warm golden lights. Around her, a dozen conversations had stopped mid-sentence. A waiter stood nearby, unsure if he should step forward or pretend he hadn't seen anything. The pianist had taken his hands off the keys, staring quietly at the couple. The restaurant's luxury now felt like a cruel stage, every sparkling chandelier and polished surface amplifying her humiliation. Daniel Hayes leaned back in his chair, as if the kick had been nothing more than a minor outburst. He picked up his wineglass again and took a long, deliberate sip. The crimson liquid caught the light as he swirled it in his hand. A calm man in complete control of his world, or so he believed. Clara tried to steady her breathing. Her body trembled uncontrollably, the pain in her legs sharp with every heartbeat. She could feel the eyes of strangers drilling into her, yet none of them spoke. Some were too afraid, some too polite. Others simply pretended to be invisible. At the table next to them, a woman in pearls leaned closer to her husband. She whispered softly, but the silence made her words travel farther than she thought. Did he just kick her? She's pregnant. Her husband hushed her. Keep your voice down. That man looks dangerous. Another guest across the aisle muttered under his breath. That's Daniel Hayes. He owns half the real estate downtown. You don't want to mess with people like him. Clara could hear them. Every word felt like a knife twisting deeper into her shame. Her lips trembled. She wanted to defend herself, to tell them the truth, but no words would come. Her voice felt trapped in her throat, as if fear had wrapped a hand around it. The restaurant manager appeared at the edge of the room, drawn by the tension. He was a tall man in his 50s, wearing a crisp white shirt and a polite smile that faltered the moment he saw Clara's tear-streaked face. He approached cautiously. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his tone hesitant. "Is everything all right?" Daniel looked up slowly, setting down his wineglass with exaggerated calm. "Of course," he said smoothly. "My wife is just feeling emotional. Pregnancy. You know how it is." The manager hesitated. His gaze flicked from Daniel's composed face to Clara's trembling hands. She was shaking, her knuckles white as she gripped the tablecloth. "Ma'am," the manager asked softly, "do you need any help?" Before she could answer, Daniel's cold voice sliced through the air. "She doesn't need anything. We're leaving soon." His hand reached across the table, not gently but with ownership, as if to reclaim control. Clara flinched back, pulling her arm to her chest. The subtle movement did not escape the crowd's notice. Several phones lifted slightly, pretending to check notifications but recording everything. The young waiter from before reappeared with the check. His face looked tight, his jaw clenched. He placed the leather folder on the table and whispered, "Sir, I think she needs medical attention." Daniel's eyes flicked toward him, cold and sharp. "Mind your own business," he said quietly, but his tone carried a threat that made the boy take a step back. Clara swallowed hard, her throat burned. The world around her felt blurred, as if the chandelier lights were too bright and her vision too weak. Her reflection shimmered faintly on the silverware. In it, she saw herself, tired, small, broken. She wanted to stand. She wanted to leave. But her legs wouldn't move. The silence broke again, softly at first. "She's crying," someone whispered. "Look, she's actually crying." "Maybe he didn't mean it," another voice said, uncertain. "Maybe it was an accident." "Accident? You saw how hard he hit her leg." The whispers grew like waves rippling through the room. Some guests were angry, some curious. A few were already posting online, the glow of their screens reflecting in their eyes. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. He could feel the attention turning against him, but instead of apologizing, he gave a short, cruel smile. "People always love a little drama," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. He pushed his chair back and stood, buttoning his jacket. The chair scraped against the floor, loud and ugly. "Clara," he said flatly, "get up. We're leaving." "Oh." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She shook her head slightly. "I can't," she whispered. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Don't make a scene." But the scene was already made. Every phone, every glance, every whisper had trapped him inside a story that was no longer under his control. The manager stepped forward again, trying to calm the situation. "Mr. Hayes, please, let us help you both. Maybe you should wait for the paramedics." Daniel laughed. "Paramedics? You must be out of your mind. Do I look like a criminal?" The word hung in the air. Criminal. Clara's eyes filled with tears again. She turned her head slightly and caught sight of something in the distance. The man in the black jacket. He was still there at the bar, his gaze fixed on her table. He didn't move, but something in his eyes gave her a strange sense of safety, like the first breath after drowning. Daniel reached for her arm. She recoiled instinctively, knocking over her glass of water. It spilled across the table, soaking the tablecloth and dripping onto the floor. A waiter hurried forward with a towel, but Daniel snapped, "Don't touch it. Just get out of my sight." The waiter froze, then stepped back quietly. Clara wiped her face, her body trembling. "Please, stop. You're hurting me." Her voice was small, but it carried. Every ear in the room heard it. That single sentence shifted something invisible. The whispers turned into murmurs. A woman stood from her chair. "This is not right," she said firmly. Another followed. The manager's radio crackled softly. Daniel's confidence began to falter. He straightened his tie again, forcing a grin, pretending he was still in control. But the spell was broken. Clara sat still, tears running down her cheeks. She stared at the empty wine glass in front of her, the red stain on the rim like a reminder of everything that had been lost. The waiter hovered near the wall, clutching his phone. The manager whispered something to him, and the boy nodded quickly before stepping into the hallway. Clara didn't know it yet, but help was already on its way. And across the room, the quiet man in the black jacket finally set his glass down. He looked toward the table where Daniel Hayes stood towering over his wife, and his jaw tightened slightly. The faint light caught the edges of his face. He pulled a small phone from his pocket and pressed record. The whispers faded again. The entire restaurant watched in silence as a story no one expected continued to unfold. The murmurs would not stop. They rose and fell like waves against glass, each whisper carrying the same word. Violence, husband, pregnant. Daniel Hayes felt it in the air. The judgment, the disgust, the heat of silent condemnation pressing against his back. He could see phones tilted at subtle angles, cameras capturing fragments of his humiliation. It infuriated him. He had spent years building his image, crafting the perfect illusion of control. And now, in the span of 2 minutes, a single trembling woman and a few recording strangers were threatening to undo everything. He forced a smile, the kind he used in front of investors. Smooth, practiced, almost charming. Then he spoke, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Everyone please, calm down. My wife is just upset." His voice was even, but the edges were sharp. "She's pregnant, and sometimes emotions get the best of her. There's nothing to see here." He looked around the room, expecting agreement. But instead, people looked away. The manager didn't nod. The waiter didn't move. The silence after his words felt like rejection. Daniel clenched his jaw. He turned to Clara, who still sat frozen, her eyes red, her face streaked with tears. Her lips moved slightly as if she wanted to say something, but fear held her still. He hated that look, the look of fragility, the look that made people pity her. He leaned forward, resting both hands on the table, his tone soft but venomous. Do you see what you've done? You've made me look like a monster in front of everyone. Clara's voice came out faint and broken. You kicked me. Everyone saw it. Daniel laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. You tripped on the table leg. That's all. Stop exaggerating. The woman with pearls shook her head from her seat nearby. I saw what happened, she whispered to her husband. Daniel's head turned sharply. Ma'am, with all due respect, you didn't see anything clearly. My wife overreacted. That's what happens when she's under stress. She's been having complications. His words were rehearsed, calm, careful. Every lie rolled out with the ease of a man who had done this many times before. Clara's fingers twisted in her lap. She stared at the tablecloth, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The sound of her heartbeat echoed in her ears. Daniel reached for her arm, pretending tenderness but gripping too tightly. You're making a scene, Clara. This isn't good for you, or for the baby. Her breath caught. You hurt me, she whispered. His voice dropped low. You keep saying that, and people will believe you. And then what? Do you think anyone will care once I tell them about your breakdown last month? Her eyes filled again. He was rewriting the story, twisting it like he always did, turning her truth into his weapon. The restaurant manager took a step forward. Mr. Hayes, he said quietly, I think it would be best if you and your wife took a moment outside. Daniel smiled politely, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. I appreciate your concern, but this is just a misunderstanding. You know how these things go. People see one thing, think another. That's how rumors start. He looked at the tables around him, his voice louder now, crafted for an audience. I love my wife. She's carrying our first child. I'd never hurt her. Isn't that right, Clara? Clara stared at him, silent. The weight of every eye in the room pressed against her. She wanted to scream the truth, to tell them everything. The nights of shouting, the bruises hidden beneath sleeves, the endless apologies that followed. But she couldn't. Her voice refused to come. Daniel tilted his head, his tone dripping with mock concern. See? She's just overwhelmed. Pregnancy hormones. Emotional. That's all. A few guests exchanged uncertain glances. Some wanted to believe him, if only to ease their own discomfort. Others looked at Clara and knew the truth but said nothing. Daniel took advantage of the silence. People today love a scandal. They'll twist anything for attention, but my wife and I are fine. He placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, pretending to be affectionate. She flinched slightly, and his fingers tightened in warning. The man at the bar, the one in the black jacket, watched every movement. His jaw tensed. Daniel turned toward the manager again. Can we please have some privacy now? I don't appreciate being gawked at like an animal. The manager's voice was calm but firm. Sir, this isn't about privacy. We just want to make sure your wife is safe. Daniel's smile thinned. Safe? From what? From me? He laughed softly, shaking his head. That's ridiculous. He stood up, adjusting his jacket. The power in his body language was deliberate. Every motion said, I am in control. He leaned close to Clara's ear. Stand up. Now. We're leaving. Her lips parted in a trembling whisper. Please, stop. The words struck him like a spark on dry wood. His jaw tightened. You love playing the victim, don't you? Across the room, the whispers began again, lower this time but sharper. He's lying, someone murmured. He's gaslighting her. Daniel turned toward the crowd, his tone raised slightly. People should really mind their own business. This is a private matter between husband and wife. The waiter spoke up suddenly. Sir, you heard her. We all saw it. The restaurant fell silent again. Daniel's eyes darkened. Watch your mouth, he warned. Do you even know who I am? The young waiter swallowed hard but didn't step back. The fear in his eyes was replaced with something stronger, disgust. Daniel let out a long breath, forcing calm back into his voice. Look, I'm sorry if I startled anyone. I shouldn't have raised my voice. I just get frustrated sometimes. She doesn't take care of herself. The words came out almost gentle, like concern, but every syllable was soaked in manipulation. He looked at Clara again. Tell them you're fine. She shook her head slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. I'm not fine. His eyes flashed. He leaned closer, whispering, If you ruin me tonight, I'll make sure you regret it for the rest of your life. The black-jacketed man at the bar watched his reflection in the mirror. His hand hovered near his phone. Clara lowered her gaze to the tablecloth, her tears darkening the fabric. Around her, the room pulsed with tension. Daniel straightened up, addressing the crowd once more. She's confused. She's tired. We've had a long day. Please, Enjoy your dinners." He smiled, polished, perfect, confident again. To the untrained eye, he looked calm. But behind that calm was something cracking, a tiny fissure running through his carefully built world. Because no matter how loud he spoke, or how many lies he told, the truth was already spreading silently across the internet, recorded by a dozen phones, whispered between tables, carried by the eyes that refused to look away. And at the far end of the room, the man in the black jacket pressed a button on his phone and sent a message that would change everything. The tension inside the velvet table was now a living thing. It clung to the air like static before a storm. The waiters moved slower. The clinking of cutlery had vanished again. Every sound felt amplified, the faint hum of air conditioning, the distant pop of a champagne cork, the soft rustle of someone's sleeve brushing against linen. Daniel Hayes, however, seemed unbothered. He sat down again, this time with deliberate calm. He reached for his wine glass as if nothing had happened. The mask was back in place. The charming executive, the man of power and grace, the image he had crafted for years. He lifted the glass slowly, his pinky finger raised in a gesture that looked absurdly polite given the chaos he had caused. He swirled the deep red liquid and looked across the table at Clara. She sat silently, her tears drying into faint streaks on her cheeks. Her shoulders were trembling beneath the thin straps of her dress. Daniel smiled faintly. "You see, this is why people misunderstand us," he said softly, though his voice carried to the nearby tables. "They see one small thing, and suddenly I'm the villain, but they don't know the full story." Clara didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on her plate, on the reflection of her own face distorted by the silver knife beside it. Daniel took a slow sip, savoring it, as though tasting victory. He leaned back and exhaled. "Do you remember the night we first came here?" he asked. His tone was calm, almost nostalgic. "You wore that white dress. Everyone was looking at us. They called us the perfect couple." Clara's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Her lips quivered. "That was before you changed," she said softly. Daniel chuckled under his breath. "Before I changed? Or before you stopped being grateful?" The nearby guests looked away, pretending not to hear, but they couldn't block out his words. His arrogance filled every corner of the room. He turned his head slightly toward them, his smile widening. "People love to act righteous when it's not their marriage on display," he said. "You all think you understand, but relationships are complicated. A man sacrifices everything for his family, and one little misunderstanding becomes a headline." The woman in pearls whispered to her husband, "He's talking to everyone now." Daniel heard her. He smirked and raised his glass toward her in a mock toast. "To misunderstanding," he said loudly, "and to people who judge what they can't possibly comprehend." The guests shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, others pretended to check their phones. Daniel placed his glass down with a soft clink. He turned back to Clara, lowering his voice just enough for her to hear. "You like this, don't you? Making me look bad. You crave the attention." Clara shook her head. "I just wanted dinner, Daniel. I wanted peace." He laughed quietly, tilting his head. "Peace. You wouldn't know peace if it sat right next to you." His words stung like a slap. She blinked back new tears, her body tense, afraid he might actually do it again. The man in the black jacket watched from his seat near the bar, his eyes never leaving the table. He had already sent the first message to his team. Now he waited, recording quietly, as Daniel continued to unravel his own mask. Daniel leaned forward again, elbows on the table, voice smooth and taunting. "You see, Clara, this is why you'll never survive without me. I built this life for you. I gave you everything. And this is how you repay me? By crying in public and embarrassing me?" He gestured broadly at the other diners. "All of them think I'm cruel. But what they don't know is that I'm the one cleaning up your mess every time you lose control." The lies came easily now. His arrogance grew with every word. He reached for his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black credit card, holding it between two fingers. "You see this? This pays for everything. The house, the doctor, even the dress you're wearing. That's my generosity." Clara's eyes lifted slowly to meet his. "Money doesn't make you kind," she whispered. Daniel's smirk faltered for just a second. Then he laughed again, louder this time. "You always were ungrateful." "Oh." A few guests looked toward the entrance as if hoping someone would stop this. But no one moved. The restaurant had become a silent theater, each person an unwilling audience member to a play they didn't know how to end. Daniel grabbed his napkin and tossed it carelessly onto the table. The sound of the fabric hitting the plate was startlingly loud. He looked around as if daring anyone to speak. "Let me tell you all something," he said, addressing the entire room now. "You think you're better than me? You think you'd act differently if your wife disrespected you in public? Don't kid yourselves." The audacity left everyone speechless. Even the manager stood still, his mouth slightly open, unsure whether to intervene. Daniel continued, pacing his words with an air of authority. "I'm not a monster. I'm a man who demands respect. That's something people forget these days. You." He adjusted his cufflinks again, that familiar motion of control, then glanced toward the bar. His eyes met the man in the black jacket. The stranger didn't look away. Daniel smirked. "Enjoying the show?" he asked, loud enough to be heard. "You've been staring all night." The man remained silent, calm, composed. Daniel raised his glass toward him in another mocking toast. "To all the spectators in the world, always watching, never understanding." Ho! The gesture was met with absolute stillness. The clinking of glasses and murmured voices that usually filled the velvet table were gone. All that remained was the hum of tension and the faint sound of Clara's uneven breathing. Daniel finished his wine and set the empty glass down with a soft thud. "Now, if everyone's done staring, maybe we can finish our meal in peace." But peace was a lie. Clara's eyes met the stranger's for a fleeting second. In that glance, she saw something different from pity. It was purpose. He gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible. She didn't yet understand what it meant, but for the first time that night, she felt something close to hope. Daniel noticed the exchange and scoffed. "Really, Clara? You think some stranger's going to save you? No one's coming." He signaled for the waiter with 2 sharp snaps of his fingers. "Bring another bottle, something expensive. We're celebrating." "Gee." The waiter hesitated. "Celebrating, sir?" Daniel smiled darkly. "Yes, celebrating my patience." The word sent a chill through the room. And at the bar, the man in the black jacket typed one more message into his phone before slipping it quietly into his pocket. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping softly against the floor. No one noticed yet. Not Daniel, not the crowd, not even Clara. But something in the air had shifted again. The arrogance that filled the room was about to meet the weight of truth. The waiter set down the new bottle of wine, his hands trembling slightly as the cork popped. The sound broke the silence like a crack in glass. Every eye turned toward Daniel Hayes again, the man who sat with a smirk too calm, too sure of himself. He poured the wine into his own glass, ignoring Clara completely. The deep red shimmered beneath the golden light, but his reflection in it looked distorted and mean. He swirled the glass lazily, as though this were any other night. "Do you know what the problem is with people today?" he said suddenly, speaking loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Everyone's so desperate to judge others, to take one small thing out of context and make it into a scandal." No one answered. The entire room held its breath. He looked directly at the restaurant manager, who stood a few feet away, phone in hand, torn between duty and fear. "Put that away," Daniel said flatly. "You don't need to call anyone. I own half the buildings within a mile of this place, including yours, probably." The manager froze. His fingers loosened around the phone. Daniel leaned back in his chair, smiling faintly. "I could make one phone call, and your little job would vanish. Do you really want to test that?" The waiter glanced at the manager, waiting for a signal, but none came. Daniel's tone grew colder. "That's what I thought." He turned toward Clara again, his smile fading. "You've embarrassed me enough for one night. I told you not to make a scene." Her lips trembled. "You made the scene, Daniel, not me." He laughed quietly, setting down his glass with a soft clink. "You're getting brave now. I wonder why." He followed her gaze across the room, toward the man in the black jacket who sat silently near the bar. Their eyes met for the second time. Daniel's expression hardened. He tilted his head slightly. "Ah, so that's what this is about. You think some stranger cares about you. You think someone's going to save you." Clara shook her head, her eyes glistening. "I just want you to stop." "Stop?" he repeated. "Stop what? Providing for you, protecting you? You've lost your mind." She opened her mouth to speak, but he cut her off, his voice rising enough for others to hear again. "I've worked my whole life to build something. Power, respect. Do you think I'll let you ruin that because of one little misunderstanding?" The manager took a cautious step forward. "Mr. Hayes, please, let's all calm down." Daniel turned on him sharply. "Don't tell me to calm down. Do you even know who you're talking to?" He stood abruptly, the chair legs scraping against the floor. I could buy this entire restaurant before breakfast tomorrow. I could have it shut down by lunch. The guests at the surrounding tables looked uneasy. The woman in pearls clutched her purse closer. Someone whispered, "He's unhinged." Daniel pointed toward the door. "Anyone who wants to record this, go ahead. I'll have my lawyers deal with you by morning. Privacy laws, defamation, slander, you name it. I've sued bigger people than you." A man at another table muttered quietly, "He's threatening everyone now." Daniel turned toward him. "Did you say something?" The man shook his head quickly. Daniel laughed again, a hollow sound that bounced off the marble walls. "That's what I thought. You people love drama, but none of you have the courage to stand up and take responsibility." He sat down again, breathing heavily. He poured himself another drink, spilling a little wine onto the tablecloth. The stain spread slowly, dark red on white linen. He didn't bother to wipe it. "Do you see, Clara?" he said softly, almost tenderly. "This is what happens when you make me angry. People get hurt. Not because I want to hurt them, but because they force me to remind them who's in charge." Her hand trembled on the table. "You're hurting yourself," she whispered. He ignored her. "I've built an empire from nothing. People respect me because they know what happens if they don't." He looked around, letting his gaze linger on each face. "And tonight, all of you are going to forget what you think you saw. Because if you don't, I'll make sure your names never appear on a guest list in this city again." The words rolled through the air like thunder. The waiter near the bar clenched his fists. The manager's jaw tightened, but he still didn't speak. Fear had a way of keeping men quiet. Clara sat perfectly still. She could feel the pulse in her neck racing. She could taste salt in her mouth from crying. But beneath the fear, something else was beginning to rise. A quiet anger. A sense of disbelief that this man could stand here and believe himself untouchable. Daniel leaned back again, now calmer, almost smug. "You see how easy that is? Power. One word from me, and everything stops." He looked at the manager. "Bring me the owner's card. I'd like to have a word with him tomorrow about your staff. Some of them seem to have forgotten how to treat paying customers." The manager didn't move. "Sir, please, you should go home." Daniel smiled without humor. "Home? Why? I'm enjoying myself. My wife and I are just having a conversation, a perfectly normal one." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "Actually, maybe I'll make a few calls right now." Clara's eyes widened. "Daniel, please don't." He ignored her and tapped his screen. "Let's see who's awake. The chief of police owes me a favor. So does the mayor's assistant. And the building inspector who signed off this restaurant's license." He looked up at the trembling staff. "You're all so quick to forget who keeps this city running." A low voice came from the bar. "People like you don't keep it running. You poison it." Daniel turned his head. The man in the black jacket had spoken at last. The sound of his voice was calm, steady, and dangerous in its quietness. Daniel smirked. "And who exactly are you?" The man didn't answer. Not yet. He simply stood, slowly, as though testing the air. Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "Another hero with a phone and a moral compass. Trust me, you don't want to get involved." The man's eyes never left his. "You're right, I don't want to, but I already am." A ripple of whispers spread again across the restaurant. Phones rose higher, recording openly now. Daniel straightened, realizing his grip on the room was slipping. His tone turned desperate beneath the arrogance. "I can ruin every single one of you," he shouted. "Don't you understand who I am?" But the crowd no longer cared. The spell of power he had built around himself was cracking. And as his words echoed uselessly across the silent room, Clara finally looked up at him with clear, steady eyes. For the first time all night, he saw no fear in them, only pity. For a moment, silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. The restaurant that once buzzed with music and laughter now felt like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. Every guest sat frozen in place, watching Daniel Hayes as he stood there, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling like a man cornered by his own arrogance. The wine bottle tipped on its side, spilling slowly across the tablecloth. The red stain spread toward Clara's trembling hands. She didn't move. Her knuckles were white, her breathing shallow, her eyes glassy from exhaustion. The ache in her legs still pulsed where he had kicked her, but she could no longer feel pain, only disbelief. Daniel leaned over her, his voice sharp but quiet, like a blade pressed against skin. "You think you can humiliate me in front of everyone? You think anyone here will help you?" Clara said nothing. Her lips were dry, her body tense. His tone grew colder. "Say something," she whispered. "Please, stop." "No." That single sentence was enough to ignite him again. His hand shot out, gripping the back of her chair so tightly that the wood creaked under his fingers. The audience gasped. "Stop? You don't get to tell me to stop," he hissed. "You live in my house, you wear my clothes, you eat because of me. You wouldn't survive a day without me." Clara flinched as his face came closer, his breath hot against her cheek. The chandelier light reflected off the sweat on his forehead. "Daniel," she pleaded, "you're scaring me." The words hit him like a challenge. He slammed his fist against the table. The sound rang out like a gunshot. Plates rattled, glasses toppled, and one shattered into pieces on the floor. The manager rushed forward instinctively, but Daniel spun around, eyes blazing. "Stay back," he shouted. The man froze mid-step. Clara covered her stomach, the instinct of a mother protecting what was left untouched by cruelty. Tears blurred her vision. "Please," she whispered again, "not in front of them." Her voice cracked, raw and trembling. The quiet broke. People began to move. One woman stood up. "You need to stop," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "She's pregnant." Daniel turned toward her. "Mind your own business." A man at the next table rose too. "You can't talk to her like that." Daniel pointed at him, his eyes wild. "Sit down, all of you. You have no idea who I am." "No." He looked around, searching for authority, for control, but all he found were eyes full of judgment. The power he once held over the room was gone. Clara tried to stand, gripping the edge of the table for balance. "I need to leave," she said weakly. Daniel stepped in front of her, blocking the way. "You're not going anywhere." He reached out and grabbed her wrist. His fingers dug into her skin. She gasped in pain. That sound, pure, helpless pain, was the final spark. The waiter who had been silently filming at the back of the room dropped his towel and stepped forward. "Let her go, sir." Daniel glared. "Stay out of this." The waiter didn't move. "You're hurting her." The restaurant erupted in murmurs. A few people pulled out their phones, recording openly now. Clara's voice trembled. "Please, Daniel. Everyone's watching." He looked around, realizing it was true. Every phone pointed at him. Every face reflected the same horror. He released her wrist suddenly, shoving her away as if she were something filthy. She stumbled backward, her chair tipping over. The sound of it hitting the floor echoed through the room. For a brief second, she stood still, stunned, one hand clutching her belly, the other reaching for the table. Then her body gave way. She fell to her knees, the marble floor cold beneath her palms. Gasps filled the air. A woman screamed. Daniel froze. His eyes widened in disbelief. The room around him blurred. He hadn't meant to push her that hard. At least that's what he told himself. But the damage was done. The waiter knelt beside Clara, his voice urgent. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Stay still. Someone call an ambulance." Clara shook her head weakly. "No hospitals. Please, not yet." The manager spoke into his radio, his voice shaking. "We need emergency medical services at the Velvet Table, downtown." Daniel reached out as if to fix what he had done. "Clara, get up." "I didn't mean..." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with something that wasn't fear anymore. It was clarity. "You always mean it." He froze, his mouth half open, unable to find an answer. The waiter helped her into a chair, wrapping his jacket around her shoulders. "You're safe now," he said softly. Daniel's breathing quickened. He turned toward the staff, pointing an accusatory finger. "If any of you post those videos, I'll sue you into the ground. Do you understand? You'll lose everything." The crowd murmured louder. Phones were already uploading, screens glowing like tiny verdicts. "Stop filming," he yelled. "This is harassment." No one listened. The woman in pearls stood again, her voice trembling but loud. "You did this. We all saw it." Daniel's world began to tilt. The walls felt closer. The murmurs turned to whispers of disgust. The black-jacketed man finally rose from his seat. He walked slowly toward the chaos, calm amid the storm. His face was unreadable. Clara's eyes found his, just for a second, and she recognized him. It was the same man who had been watching quietly, his presence steady and unafraid. Daniel noticed the exchange and sneered. "Who are you supposed to be? Another one of her sympathizers? You want to play hero?" The man stopped a few feet away. His voice was calm, steady, and deep. "I just want you to stop hurting people." "Mutt." Daniel laughed nervously, his voice cracking. "You don't know what you're talking about." The man's gaze didn't waver. I know exactly what I'm talking about." A ripple of tension spread through the room. Even the staff stopped moving. The quiet became unbearable. Daniel looked around, desperate to regain control, but it was too late. His power, his composure, his lies, all of it had been shattered by the image of his wife on her knees, by the eyes of every witness, by the phone cameras that captured every second. He muttered something under his breath and took a step back. The reality of what he had done finally began to sink in. Clara sat in the chair, her breathing steadying. The waiter held her hand. The crowd formed a quiet wall of protection between her and Daniel. For the first time, he looked small. The man in the black jacket turned slightly toward the staff. "The police are on their way," he said quietly. "No one leaves until they get here." Daniel blinked, stunned. "Who the hell do you think you are?" The man looked at him calmly. "You'll find out soon enough." The room went still again. Clara closed her eyes and exhaled shakily. The sound of sirens began to echo faintly from somewhere outside. Inside the velvet table, the nightmare was far from over, but something had shifted. For the first time that night, Daniel Hayes was no longer the one in control. The sirens outside grew louder, their wailing echo slipping through the glass walls of the velvet table. Inside, time seemed suspended. Waiters stood in corners, guests frozen mid-breath, the air thick with unease and expectation. Clara Hayes sat in the chair near the overturned table, a jacket draped around her shoulders. Her breath was shallow but steady now. The tears had dried on her face, leaving faint salt lines beneath her eyes. Her hands rested protectively on her belly. For the first time that night, she wasn't trembling. Daniel Hayes paced a few feet away, his face pale with disbelief. He muttered to himself, half under his breath, half to the silent crowd that refused to look away. "This is insane. Everyone's exaggerating. She's fine. She just fell, that's all." No one believed him. The collective stillness was an accusation louder than words. The man in the black jacket stood near the center of the room, calm and watchful. He said nothing yet, but his presence was like an anchor keeping chaos from spilling over. He glanced once at Clara, as if silently telling her that she was safe and that someone was finally on her side. Daniel caught the look and clenched his fists. "What is this? You think you can step into my marriage? You think you know me?" The man's eyes remained cold. "I don't need to know you. I can see enough." Daniel laughed, a sound filled with bitterness. "Another self-righteous stranger. You have no idea who I am. I'll destroy you for this." Clara's voice broke the silence. "Stop talking." Everyone turned toward her. Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried strength. For the first time that night, Daniel actually paused. She slowly pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the ache in her leg. The room seemed to hold its breath again. Her voice was soft but firm. "You don't get to control this anymore." Daniel blinked in disbelief. "Clara, sit down. You're embarrassing yourself." "Mo?" She shook her head. "No, Daniel. You embarrassed yourself." The words hit him harder than any slap could have. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Clara steadied herself on the table, her voice growing clearer. "All these years, you said I was weak. You told me I couldn't live without you. You lied." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The woman in pearls nodded subtly, whispering to her husband. "She's standing up to him." Daniel's face reddened. "You're making a mistake. You think these people care about you? They'll forget you by tomorrow." Clara's eyes locked on his. "Maybe, but I won't forget myself." He took a step toward her, but the man in the black jacket moved forward too, placing himself between them. His voice was calm, but absolute. "Stay where you are." Daniel hesitated. Something in the man's tone made even him stop. Clara took a deep breath. "You keep saying you're powerful, but look around, Daniel. Everyone's watching you. They're not afraid of me. They're afraid of you." Her voice trembled, but she didn't falter. Each word landed with the weight of truth. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I gave you everything. The house, the money, the name Hayes means something in this city." She shook her head. "It used to. Not anymore." He laughed bitterly. "You think walking away makes you strong? You think anyone will take your side once this mess is over?" Clara lifted her chin slightly. "I don't need sides. I just need freedom." The crowd was silent again. The sound of sirens outside faded into the distance as if the world was listening to her too. The waiter who had helped her earlier whispered, "Good for you." Clara straightened her shoulders. The pain in her body was still there, but something inside her had shifted. The fear that had once kept her quiet was gone, replaced by something steadier, fiercer. Daniel tried to laugh it off. This is ridiculous. You think a few dramatic words will change anything? I'll have every lawyer in the city calling by morning. The man in the black jacket spoke again, his voice even. Maybe you should stop worrying about lawyers and start worrying about what you've already done. Daniel glared. You're enjoying this, aren't you? I don't enjoy violence, the man replied. But I've seen men like you all my life. You think money makes you untouchable. It doesn't. Daniel pointed a shaking finger at him. You don't know who you're talking to. The man took a step closer. Actually, I do. The quiet confidence in his tone made Daniel stumble backward. The arrogance that had carried him all evening was cracking again, piece by piece. Clara looked at the faces around her, people who had seen her humiliation, her fear, her pain. For once, she didn't feel shame. She felt seen. She turned back to Daniel, her voice softer now. You said no one would ever believe me, but they do. They all saw it. No. Daniel tried to speak, but his throat felt dry. The words caught somewhere between denial and regret. You said I was nothing without you, she continued. But look at me, Daniel. I'm still standing. The guests began to nod, their silence transforming into quiet support. The woman in pearls clapped once, gently, then stopped, unsure if it was allowed. Others followed her lead, tentative but sincere. Daniel's voice broke through the sound. This isn't over. You can't just walk away and pretend this never happened. Clara met his gaze. You're right, I can't pretend anymore. She took a shaky breath, her hands still resting on her stomach. I'm done pretending you're a good man. The waiter stepped closer to her side. The manager moved toward the entrance, signaling that the police had arrived outside. The flashing blue lights reflected off the restaurant's glass walls, painting streaks of color across Daniel's face. He turned toward them, desperate now. This is a mistake. I didn't do anything. I'm the victim here. The man in the black jacket crossed his arms. No, you're not. Not tonight. Daniel's eyes darted around the room, but there was no one left to save him. Clara's voice came again, low and certain. You taught me to stay silent, Daniel, but I won't be quiet anymore. The police entered the restaurant. Their footsteps echoed against the marble floor. Daniel backed away instinctively, his confidence collapsing with every second. Clara didn't move. She stood tall, calm, watching as the officers approached him. The fear that had once defined her was gone. For the first time, she was no longer the victim of the night. She was the witness, the survivor, the one who had finally spoken. And as Daniel's voice grew frantic in protest, drowned out by the sound of handcuffs clicking shut, the woman he had once controlled stood still and silent, her eyes steady, her spirit unbroken. The sound of police radios filled the air, their static blending with the fading chatter of the crowd. Blue and red lights flickered through the restaurant's glass walls, painting moving shadows across the floor. Every guest sat frozen, their attention fixed on the man who had finally lost everything he thought he could control. Daniel Hayes stood in disbelief, his face pale and sweating under the harsh light. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie crooked, and his once calm demeanor had collapsed into raw panic. The officers approached cautiously, one hand hovering near a pair of handcuffs. Sir, we need you to step back, the first officer said firmly. Daniel held up his hands, his voice trembling between anger and desperation. You're making a mistake. You don't know who I am. I can fix this. The officer replied flatly, We'll sort that out downtown. Clara sat nearby, her hands resting gently on her stomach. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were clear now. She had stopped shaking. Around her, the waiters and guests formed a silent ring of quiet support, their eyes filled with empathy and disbelief. The man in the black jacket took a slow step forward. Until now, he had been an observer, calm and distant. But something in the moment had shifted. His voice broke the silence, firm but composed. Before you take him, he said, there's something you should know. The officers turned toward him. One of them frowned. And you are? The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slim black wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a silver identification badge glinting under the chandelier light. The logo engraved on it made the officers exchange surprised glances. My name is Nathan Cole, he said quietly. Federal Financial Crimes Division. I've been investigating Daniel Hayes for over a year. The room gasped. Even the waiters looked at one another, stunned. Daniel froze in place. That's not possible. You're lying. Nathan's eyes didn't move. I don't lie, Mr. Hayes, especially not in public. He took another step closer, his voice low but powerful. You've been laundering money through shell companies under your wife's name. You thought no one would notice, but we did." Clara's eyes widened. The words hit her like a wave. She stared at Daniel, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name? You used my name?" Daniel turned toward her, his face drained of color. "Clara, please, I can explain." Nathan shook his head. "Don't bother. We've been tracking every transaction, every offshore transfer, every payment disguised as a real estate deal. Tonight wasn't just about abuse, Mr. Hayes. It was about exposure." Daniel took a shaky step back. "You can't prove anything." Nathan raised his phone. The screen glowed faintly, showing a live feed. "We already did. Every file is backed up, every message archived. The truth has a way of surviving arrogance." He turned the phone slightly so Daniel could see. "And the entire city will know by morning." The weight of those words crushed the last of Daniel's defiance. His shoulders sagged, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. The officers moved in. "Sir, you need to come with us." Daniel's voice broke, a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You can't do this to me. I built everything. I am this city." Nathan's expression stayed calm. "You were. Now you're just another man who thought money could buy silence." One of the officers pulled Daniel's hands behind his back and secured the cuffs with a metallic click. The sound echoed through the restaurant, final and irreversible. Clara watched it happen, her breath catching in her throat. The man who had once towered over her, the man who made her afraid to speak, now stood powerless before everyone he had tried to impress. Daniel turned toward her one last time, his voice cracking. "Clara, please, help me. Tell them this is a mistake." She met his eyes, her face calm. "You always said no one would believe me. Now no one believes you." He flinched as if struck. The officers led him toward the door. Cameras from guests followed every step. The light from outside washed over him as he disappeared into the night, swallowed by flashing sirens. Nathan exhaled slowly, slipping his badge back into his jacket. The tension in the room began to melt, replaced by quiet murmurs and the sound of deep breaths released in relief. The manager approached carefully. "Sir, we had no idea who you were." Nathan gave a small nod. "You handled it as best you could. Thank you for protecting her." He turned toward Clara, his voice softening. "Are you all right?" She nodded slowly. "I think so. I just can't believe this is real." Nathan crouched slightly to meet her gaze. "It's over now. He can't hurt you again." Her lips trembled. "You knew all this time?" He hesitated. "We suspected, but we needed proof. Tonight, we got more than enough." She looked down at her hands. "You were watching him." "I was watching him," Nathan said gently. "But I was also watching you, the way you endured it. The way you still tried to protect your child. You're stronger than you think." A tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it quickly. "I thought I had to keep surviving. I didn't know I could fight." Nathan smiled faintly. "You fought tonight, Clara. You stood up when he wanted you on your knees. That's the kind of strength that can't be bought." The crowd began to disperse. Some guests approached her quietly, offering words of support before leaving. The woman in pearls placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. "You were brave," she said softly. "Don't ever forget that." As the last guests exited, the restaurant grew quiet again. The broken glass had been cleared away, the lights dimmed, and only the faint hum of the city remained outside. Clara looked at Nathan, exhaustion settling into her bones. "What happens now?" He straightened slowly. "You'll give your statement to the officers. After that, you'll be taken somewhere safe. There's a protection program for victims of financial and domestic crimes. You won't be alone." She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." Nathan looked toward the door where Daniel had been taken away. His voice dropped lower, more serious. "Men like him believe they're untouchable, but the truth always catches up." Clara followed his gaze, the faintest light of peace crossing her expression. For the first time in years, she could breathe without fear. Nathan offered his hand to help her stand. She hesitated, then took it. His grip was firm, steady, and kind. As they walked toward the exit, the city lights flickered across the windows, bright and alive. The night air outside was cool and quiet, the storm finally over. And as the door of the velvet table closed behind them, Clara knew her life had changed forever. The headlines came first. By morning, Daniel Hayes's name was everywhere. The footage from the velvet table spread across every social platform before sunrise. A dozen camera angles captured his face, his voice, the sound of Clara's plea, and the exact moment he was handcuffed in front of an entire restaurant. Within hours, the story became a wildfire that no publicist could contain. Real estate tycoon Daniel Hayes arrested for assault and fraud. CEO's meltdown caught on camera. No. Pregnant wife saved by undercover billionaire. Each headline was a wound he could not cover. Inside a holding cell, Daniel sat on a metal bench, his head buried in his hands. The sound of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The cold walls, once invisible to him, now felt suffocating. He tried to tell himself it was temporary, that his lawyers would arrive any minute, that his name still meant something. But the silence in the cell told him otherwise. When the guards finally came, they led him down a narrow hallway into an interrogation room. Nathan Cole was already there, seated at a metal table, his demeanor calm and composed. A folder lay open in front of him, filled with documents and photographs. Daniel's voice was hoarse. "You have no right to do this. I know my rights. You can't keep me here." Nathan didn't look up immediately. He spoke quietly, his tone level and unshaken. "You're not here because of me. You're here because of your choices." Daniel slammed his hand against the table. "This is a setup. You think you can ruin me with one video?" Nathan closed the folder slowly. "It wasn't one video. It was years of lies. You just made it easier for the world to see who you really are." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his face pale but angry. "You think this makes you a hero? You don't understand what it's like to build something from nothing. People like me don't quit." "No." Nathan studied him for a moment. "You didn't build anything, Daniel. You destroyed it. You used people, even your own wife, to make yourself feel powerful. You didn't create an empire. You created a prison." For the first time, Daniel didn't respond. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Nathan stood up and gathered the documents. "You'll have your lawyer soon, but I wouldn't waste his time trying to deny what's already public record." Daniel's voice cracked. "You think she'll be better without me? That woman would have nothing if it weren't for me." Nathan paused at the door, his tone colder now. "Maybe, but she'll have peace, and peace is something you could never buy." The door closed behind him with a dull metallic sound. Outside, the city moved on. The stock price of Hayes Holdings plummeted before the markets even opened. Partners withdrew contracts. Banks froze his accounts. Board members distanced themselves in statements filled with phrases like deep regret and internal investigation. His empire, once untouchable, was now a house of cards collapsing under its own weight. At her temporary residence, Clara watched the news in silence. The morning light spilled through the blinds, touching the side of her face. The anchor's voice was calm and professional as she spoke of the arrest, the financial crimes, and the viral footage that had shocked the country. Clara turned off the television. The silence that followed was strange but peaceful. She sipped a cup of tea that had gone cold, then looked down at her hands. For the first time, they weren't shaking. Her phone buzzed with messages. Reporters, distant relatives, old friends she hadn't heard from in years. She didn't answer any of them. Instead, she stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city felt different. Still busy, still alive, but lighter somehow. The door opened softly behind her. Nathan stepped inside, holding a folder. "I thought you might want to see this," he said. Clara turned. "What is it?" He handed her the folder. Inside were legal documents, statements from witnesses, and a court notice. At the top, her name was written clearly. "It's the formal record," Nathan explained. "You're officially the majority shareholder now. Everything that was in your name under his manipulation reverts to you. You won." Clara stared at the papers, unable to process it for a moment. "I don't want his money," she whispered. Nathan nodded. "You don't have to keep it, but you should decide what happens to it. Maybe something good can come from what he tried to control." Her eyes softened. "Like what?" "Maybe a foundation," Nathan suggested. "For women who can't walk away. For people who think silence is their only choice." Clara's eyes welled with tears. She nodded slowly. "I like that idea." "No." Nathan smiled faintly. "Then we'll make it happen." She sat down on the couch, her hands still holding the papers. "It feels strange. He used to decide everything. What I wore, what I said, even how I smiled. And now?" Nathan asked. Clara looked up at him. "Now I get to decide what matters." The silence that followed was gentle. Outside, sunlight poured through the glass, glinting off the buildings that Daniel once owned. The city hadn't changed, but she had. Across town, inside the county jail, Daniel sat alone again. The guards had left him after questioning. The lights above flickered slightly, casting long shadows on the floor. He rubbed his temples, his thoughts a blur of anger and disbelief. He could still hear Clara's voice in his head, calm and final. "You always mean it." He tried to push it away, but it wouldn't fade. He thought about the cameras, the eyes, the moment he realized the world had turned against him. The same people who once applauded him now cursed his name. His empire had vanished overnight, leaving him with nothing but his own reflection staring back from the cell window. A guard walked by, glancing in. "Phone call, Hayes," he said. Daniel hesitated, then picked up the receiver. On the other end, his lawyer's voice was clipped and tired. "The board's voted you out. The evidence is overwhelming. We can try for a plea deal, but you're looking at multiple charges. Fraud, tax evasion, domestic assault. You should prepare yourself." Daniel's hand tightened around the receiver. "This can't be happening." "It already is," the lawyer said. Then the line went dead. He sat there, staring at the wall, listening to the faint hum of electricity. The silence around him was louder than any noise he had ever heard. For the first time, there were no admirers, no subordinates, no one left to impress, only the truth he had spent years trying to bury. Back in the city, Clara folded the court papers carefully and set them aside. She took a deep breath and smiled faintly. The nightmare was ending, and something new was beginning. Nathan stood by the door, watching her quietly. "You did the hardest part," he said. "You faced him." Clara nodded. "Maybe, but I'm still learning how to live without fear." He smiled. "That's where freedom starts." Outside, the afternoon sun rose higher over the skyline. For the first time in years, Clara Hayes felt the warmth without flinching. Her past had collapsed, but in the ruins, she had found herself. The courtroom was quiet when the verdict was read. The faint hum of the ceiling fans filled the space between every word the judge spoke. Daniel Hayes sat at the defense table, his face hollow and pale, the once polished man now reduced to a shadow of what he had been. His expensive suit looked out of place against the dull wooden benches and gray walls. "Mr. Hayes," the judge said, her voice calm and firm, "you are hereby sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for aggravated assault, tax fraud, and financial manipulation. You will also forfeit all properties obtained through illegal transactions." The sound of the gavel striking wood echoed like a final heartbeat. Daniel flinched but didn't look up. In the front row, Clara sat still, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't cry. She had shed all her tears months ago. Now, she simply breathed. Each breath was a small victory, a quiet reminder that survival was possible. Nathan Cole stood beside her, a steady presence as always. He didn't speak either. Some truths didn't need words. As the guards led Daniel away, he turned his head once. His eyes met Clara's for the briefest moment. There was no apology, no remorse, only disbelief that the world had moved on without him. She didn't look away. She didn't feel anger anymore, only release. Outside the courthouse, the air was warm and bright. A cluster of reporters stood behind barricades, their cameras ready, their voices calling questions. Clara paused at the top of the courthouse steps, the sunlight catching her hair, the city stretching out before her. "Nathan," she said softly, "I'm ready to go home." He nodded. "Let's go." They walked together through the crowd, the noise fading behind them. It wasn't about fame or headlines anymore. The world had taken its fill of drama. What remained was quiet. Weeks passed. The city moved on, as cities always do. The story of Daniel Hayes became another cautionary tale in the endless news cycle. But for Clara, life didn't return to what it was before. It became something new, something real. Her mornings began with the sound of soft laughter. Her son, born a month after the trial, was the center of that laughter. She named him Evan. The name meant light, and every time she whispered it, it felt like a prayer answered. Their apartment was small but bright. Sunlight poured through white curtains, warming the wooden floors. There were no marble countertops, no expensive chandeliers, no staff, just peace. Clara sat by the window one morning, watching Evan sleep in his cradle. The soft rhythm of his breathing filled the room. Her cup of coffee had gone cold again, but she didn't mind. Her phone buzzed. It was Nathan. "Meeting at 10?" She smiled and texted back, "I'll be there." By 10 o'clock, Clara walked into a downtown office building where a small sign read, "The Hayes Foundation for Women and Children." The name felt strange at first, but Nathan had insisted. "You're taking back what he stole," he had told her. "Let his name remind people what change looks like." Inside, The walls were lined with photographs of survivors, women who had left abusive homes, mothers who had rebuilt their lives, children who smiled again. Clara walked through the hallway, greeting volunteers, pausing to talk to a young woman holding a baby. The woman's eyes were tired but hopeful. "You saved me," the woman said quietly. Clara shook her head. "No, you saved yourself. I just gave you a place to start." Nathan stood by the door to the main office, watching her with a faint smile. "You're getting good at this," he said. She turned toward him. "I still get nervous when I talk to them." "Lack. That's because you care," he said. "That's what makes you different." She smiled, her eyes soft. "I don't feel different. I just feel free." Nathan nodded. "That's what freedom is supposed to feel like." He handed her a folder. "The board approved the new grant program. It's enough to open 3 more shelters by next year." Her eyes lit up. 3 more? He nodded. "We'll announce it tonight at the gala, and before you say no, you're giving the speech. You deserve that moment." "All," Clara laughed quietly. "I was afraid you'd say that." That evening, the city glowed under golden light. The gala was held in a renovated hall overlooking the skyline. The same city that once looked down on her now stood as witness to her rebirth. The room was filled with people, donors, survivors, advocates. Soft music played, and the clinking of glasses replaced the sound of fear. When it was time, Nathan introduced her. "Tonight, we celebrate resilience, and no one embodies that more than Clara Hayes." Applause rose, warm and genuine. Clara stepped onto the small stage. She paused for a moment, the lights gentle on her face, the crowd expectant but kind. She took a deep breath. "A year ago, I thought my life was over," she began. "I thought silence was the only way to survive, but I learned that silence doesn't protect you. It only protects the people who hurt you." Her voice grew steadier. "I lost everything I thought I needed. And then I realized what truly matters can't be bought or taken away. It's peace, it's safety, it's the courage to begin again." The room was silent except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the occasional sniffle from someone wiping a tear. Clara smiled faintly. "If you're here tonight because you're afraid, because you think no one will believe you, I want you to know you're not alone. Help is real. Hope is real. You deserve to live." The crowd rose in applause. Nathan stood at the back, clapping quietly, his expression proud but humble. As the music swelled again, Clara stepped down from the stage. A few guests came to thank her, but her eyes searched for one thing: the open balcony overlooking the city. She stepped outside. The night air was cool, the stars faint above the glowing skyline. For the first time in years, she let the quiet fill her completely. Nathan joined her, standing beside her without saying a word. The city lights reflected in the glass, painting them both in gold. Clara turned to him, her voice soft. "Do you think people can really change?" He looked out over the skyline. "I think people can choose to become who they were meant to be." She smiled. "Then I think I finally did." Inside, the music rose again. Laughter echoed. The night continued, but for Clara, it was enough to stand there, breathing freely, knowing the world no longer held her captive. Below the balcony, the foundation's banner fluttered in the wind. Sometimes, the strongest act of courage is asking for help. And as the lights of the city glimmered beneath her, Clara Hayes finally understood. Justice was not about punishment. It was about reclaiming life. And tonight, she had done exactly that.
Millionaire abandoned wife for model. She arrived at his wedding in limo with triplets. The words didn't slice. They sanitized. Julian Thorne, a man who built an empire on calculated risks, was now eliminating one. "The marriage is no longer a viable asset, Alara," he said, the skyline of the city he'd conquered gleaming behind him like a crown of cold jewels. His voice, once the anchor of her world, was now the sterile tone of a press release. He slid a leather-bound portfolio across the polished expanse of his desk. It landed with a soft, final thud. "The settlement is more than generous. It is, of course, contingent upon your signature on a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement." He didn't look at her. He looked at the future, a future she was not in. "I am marrying Serafina Dubois. The wedding is in 6 months." And in that moment, as her world dissolved into the silent hum of the penthouse air conditioning, the only sound Alara could hear was the frantic, desperate flutter of 3 tiny heartbeats inside her. a secret he had just rendered utterly worthless. Before we begin, take a moment and comment your city below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from around the world. Now, let's dive in. Their beginning hadn't been in a penthouse. It had been in a garage. Not a trendy Silicon Valley garage, but a damp, oil-stained box in a forgotten suburb, smelling of rust and ambition. Julian Thorne, then, was not a name but a verb, a relentless force of creation. He had blueprints in his eyes and engine grease under his fingernails. Ilara Vance wasn't his asset, she was his architect. While he wrestled with code and soldering irons, she built the scaffolding of their life. She organized the chaos, paid the bills with her meager paralegal salary, and believed in the man whose dreams were too big for their tiny apartment. She remembered the night he finally cracked the algorithm for his revolutionary logistics software Nexus. He hadn't celebrated with champagne. He had collapsed into her arms, weeping with an exhaustion so profound it felt holy. "We did it, Elle," he'd whispered into her hair, his body trembling. "Not me. We." In that moment, they were a single entity, fused by shared struggle and unwavering faith. She was the steady hand that held the compass while he charted the stars. She proofread his patents, negotiated with his first, skeptical suppliers, and calmed him during the panic attacks that came like clockwork in the dead of night, when the fear of failure was a physical monster in the room. The money, when it came, was a tidal wave. First a trickle, then a stream, then a biblical flood that swept them from their cramped apartment and deposited them into the stratosphere of wealth. The garage was replaced by a glass tower. The greasy rags were replaced by bespoke suits. Julian Thorne, the verb, became Julian Thorne, the brand, and something inside him began to calcify. The late-night talks about dreams were replaced by strategy sessions about market share. The shared, exhausted weeping was replaced by a solitary, steely-eyed focus. Ilara tried to hold on to the man from the garage. She hosted intimate dinners, hoping to find him again in the laughter of old friends. But he would remain distant, his mind clearly on quarterly reports. She tried to lure him away on spontaneous trips to the coast, to the kind of windswept, anonymous places where they had once felt most like themselves. But his phone was a phantom limb, an extension of his will that never ceased its buzzing. He was a king now, and a king has no time for the quiet memories of the man he once was. He started speaking of legacy as if it were a fortress to be built, not a life to be lived. "Image is everything, Ilara," he would say, his gaze sweeping over her sensible, elegant dresses with a new, critical light. "Perception is reality." He was no longer building a company, he was curating a dynasty. The first time he mentioned Serafina Dubois, it was with the same detached tone he used to discuss a corporate acquisition. "She's the new face of the Thorne Foundation's global campaign, a significant social media footprint. Excellent optics." Ilara had seen the pictures. Serafina was a sculpture of a woman, flawless and breathtaking, a living embodiment of the polished, inhuman perfection Julian now worshipped. She was not a partner, she was a jewel, the final, perfect stone to be set in his crown. Ilara felt the shift, not as a sudden earthquake, but as a slow, tectonic drift. He was moving away from her, from their shared history, from the garage and the late-night fears and the sacred promise of we. He was calving off the part of his life that reminded him of vulnerability, of struggle, of the man who once needed her to hold him together. When she discovered she was pregnant, a fragile hope flickered within her. A child, a legacy not of steel and glass, but of flesh and blood. A reason to return to the beginning. She planned a special dinner, a quiet moment to bring him back to the we that had been their genesis. But he canceled. A last-minute trip to Zurich. He canceled the next night, too. A merger. Finally, she walked into his office. The positive pregnancy test clutched in her purse like a talisman. He was on the phone, his back to her, looking out at his kingdom. "The metrics are undeniable," he was saying. "It's a clean cut, minimal fallout." He turned, saw her, and his face did not soften. It sharpened. He ended the call. And then came the speech. The sanitized corporate execution. The marriage was no longer a viable asset. The settlement, the NDA. He never gave her the chance to tell him. As he spoke of Serafina and the wedding, her secret became a lead weight in her stomach. It was a truth that no longer had any market value in the empire of Julian Thorne. She walked out of that glass tower, the leather portfolio in her hand, feeling like a ghost. He hadn't just left her, he had unwritten her from his history. Back in the silent, cavernous penthouse that was once their home, she sank onto the floor and finally let the sobs come, her hands protectively wrapped around her abdomen. It was no longer just her he had abandoned. He had abandoned them, all four of them. And in the depths of that soul-crushing despair, a new feeling began to germinate. It was cold, it was hard, and it was patient. It was not hatred, it was resolve. He wanted to erase his past. She would, in her own time, force a reckoning with it. The 6 months that followed were a crucible. Julian Thorne, in his infinite, callous efficiency, had ensured Alara wanted for nothing materially. A sprawling, sun-drenched villa in a quiet coastal town appeared in her name, staffed and secured. Funds, vast and silent, flowed into a private account. It was a golden cage, designed to keep her comfortable, silent, and invisible. He was paying for her absence, outsourcing the messy business of a discarded life. But he had miscalculated. He had assessed Alara as a liability to be managed, not as a woman with a spine of forged steel. She did not languish in her gilded prison. The shock gave way to a profound maternal ferocity. She was no longer just Alara. She was a vessel, a guardian. Her body, once a source of betrayal and heartbreak, became a sacred space. Her days fell into a quiet rhythm. Prenatal yoga, long walks on the beach where the salt spray felt like a baptism, and hours spent in the library of her new home. She wasn't reading fiction, she was studying. She read about single parenting, about early childhood development, about trust funds and estate planning. She was building an ark for her children, a world where they would be defined by their mother's love, not their father's absence. Then came the day of the ultrasound. The technician, a kind woman with gentle eyes, glided the wand over her belly. "Well," the woman said, a slow smile spreading across her face, "there's one healthy heartbeat." She paused, repositioning the wand. "And there's the second one." Alara's breath caught in her throat. 2 twins. A wave of terror and joy washed over her. Before she could fully process it, the technician's eyes widened slightly. "Oh my. Hold on a moment." She zoomed in, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Would you look at that? Hello, little one." She turned the screen towards Alara. 1, 2, and 3. "Congratulations, Mama. You've got a full house. Triplets." The word echoed in the small, dark room, a pronouncement of fate. It was terrifying. It was magnificent. It was a secret of such magnitude that it felt like a weapon. That night she didn't cry. She sat on her veranda, watching the moon rise over the ocean, and she laughed. A low, throaty laugh that started in her belly and filled the night air. It was the laugh of a woman who had just been handed a cosmic joke of divine proportions. Julian, the master planner, the king of controlled outcomes, had created a chaotic, beautiful, triplicate secret that was growing, day by day, outside the bounds of his meticulously crafted world. Meanwhile, the world was saturated with Julian and Serafina. They were on the cover of magazines, their perfect faces smiling out from a world of impossible glamour. "The power couple redefining legacy," one headline blared. Another, an exclusive interview with Serafina, was titled, "I'm not marrying a millionaire, I'm marrying a visionary." In the article, Serafina spoke of Julian's desire for a family, when the time is right. She spoke of their shared vision for a streamlined, impactful life. Alara read the words without bitterness. It was like watching a play, a piece of theater so disconnected from reality that it was almost comical. Julian wasn't a visionary. He was an editor, cutting out any part of the story that didn't fit his narrative. The birth was an ordeal of fire and grace. 2 boys, Liam and Noah, and a girl, Chloe. They were tiny, fragile, and perfect. Looking at their 3 sleeping faces, Alara felt a love so fierce it was a physical force. They were her world, her purpose, her everything. The ghost of Julian Thorne, the man in the glass tower, faded into insignificance, replaced by the overwhelming reality of these 3 miraculous lives. She hired a small, trusted staff, a nanny, a chef, a security guard, all of whom were women who had faced their own hardships. Her villa became a quiet matriarchy, a sanctuary of resilience. As the months turned into a year, then 2, then 3, Julian's attempts to enforce the silence of the NDA became more pronounced. A lawyer would call her own, a man she had hired who was as shrewd as he was loyal. There were concerns about a photo a local had snapped of her with the children on the beach. There were gentle reminders about the terms of the agreement. Julian was a ghost who haunted the periphery of her life, a distant, paranoid king checking the locks on his gilded cage. Ilara's resistance was a masterclass in subtlety. She never breached the contract. She never spoke his name. She simply lived. She lived a full, vibrant, and visible life within her small town. She donated to the local library her name, Ilara Vance, engraved on a small brass plaque. She funded a new wing for the pediatric ward at the local hospital. She was not a recluse. She was a pillar. Her power was not in what she said, but in the life she built, a life that stood as a silent testament to the one he had discarded. The children grew. Liam was quiet and observant, with Julian's intense eyes. Noah was a whirlwind of energy, a boisterous, laughing boy. And Chloe was the diplomat, a serious little girl with a wisdom that seemed ancient. Ilara never lied to them. As they grew old enough to ask, she told them a simple, unadorned truth. Your father was a man who had a very important job, and he couldn't be a father too. But you were made from so much love, a love so big it had to be split into 3. The announcement of Julian's wedding anniversary, their 5th, was the catalyst. It wasn't a quiet affair. It was to be the social event of the decade, a grand ball at his sprawling country estate, renewing his vows with Serafina. The theme, blasted across every society page, was legacy and a look to the future. It was a monument to his own curated reality. That was when Ilara decided. It was time, not for revenge. Revenge was a small, petty thing. This was about a reckoning, a moral audit. Her lawyer advised against it. You're poking the dragon, Ilara. The dragon has been asleep for 5 years, she replied, her voice calm. It's time for him to be reminded of what he burned down. Her plan began to take shape, meticulous and precise. She wasn't going to crash the wedding. She was going to make an appearance, an arrival. A statement not of words, but of presence. She started digging, not into his finances, but into his history. The official story was that Julian Thorne was a self-made man, a genius who sprang from nothing. But Ilara had been there. She remembered faint, dismissed stories about his father, a man Julian referred to only as a failed dreamer, a man who had died years ago alone and, according to Julian, a drunk. Something about it had never sat right. Julian's shame about his father was too venomous, too absolute. Using a private investigator, a discreet woman who specialized in finding forgotten people, Ilara started pulling at the threads. The investigator found a last known address for Arthur Thorne, a rundown boarding house in a forgotten industrial town. She found a storage locker, paid for in cash for years by an anonymous benefactor, the payments having stopped a few months after Arthur's death. Inside that locker, covered in a dusty tarp, was the ghost of another man's life. There were boxes of journals filled with elegant looping script. There were intricate schematics drawn with a draftsman's precision. And there was a prototype. A clunky, oversized version of a device that looked startlingly, terrifyingly familiar. It was a primitive version of the core hardware component that made Julian's Nexus's system possible. Ilara spent a week with those journals, the air in her library thick with the scent of old paper and stale grief. The story they told was not of a failed dreamer or a drunk. It was the story of a brilliant, gentle man named Arthur Thorne. A man obsessed with solving the puzzle of logistics, of creating a system that could connect the world more efficiently. A man who wrote about his son Julian with a heartbreaking mixture of pride and fear. Julian has a fire in him, one entry read. A fire I worry will consume the kindling of his own heart. He sees my work not as a passion, but as a failure to monetize. He has the mind of a predator, and I fear he sees me as prey. The final entries were a portrait of despair. Arthur described how Julian, then a ruthless young man on the rise, had visited him. He had belittled his work, called his prototypes toys, and offered him a pittance to sign away any and all intellectual property rights. Arthur had refused. 2 weeks later, his small workshop had a fire. An accident, the report said. All his primary research was destroyed. Shortly after, Julian Thorne launched his first company, built on a revolutionary concept that was, in fact, a polished, weaponized version of his own father's dream. The anonymous benefactor paying for the storage locker? Ilara suspected it was someone from Arthur's past, someone who knew. This was the truth. Julian Thorne wasn't a self-made man. He was a grave robber. He hadn't just abandoned his wife and children. He had built his entire empire on the tomb of his own father. The fortress of his legacy was built on a lie, cemented with the ashes of a man he had erased. Ilara closed the final journal, the leather cool beneath her fingers. Her heart wasn't pounding with rage. It was still with a terrible, clarifying calm. She now understood the hollowness in Julian's eyes, the paranoid obsession with control, the desperate need to build a flawless image. He wasn't protecting a legacy, he was hiding a crime not of law, but of the soul. The invitation to the wedding gala arrived as she knew it would, a courtesy, a final, arrogant reminder of the world she was excluded from. It sat on her desk, a cream and gold declaration of war. She picked up the phone and called a high-end limousine service. Then she called a designer in Paris, one known for creating bespoke evening gowns for children. The plan was no longer just an arrival. It was a resurrection. She wasn't just bringing his children to his door. She was bringing the ghost of his father. The day of the gala was a masterpiece of orchestrated perfection. Julian Thorne's country estate was transformed into an ethereal wonderland. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ancient oaks, a symphony orchestra played softly on the main lawn, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with wealth. Julian stood on the grand steps of his Georgian manor, Serafina, a vision in diamond white, at his side. She was beautiful, poised, a perfect queen for his perfect kingdom. But Julian's smile didn't reach his eyes. For 5 years, he had lived in a state of low-grade, vigilant paranoia. The Ilara situation had been handled. Yet the silence was, in its own way, unsettling. He'd expected a fight, a lawsuit, a messy tabloid scandal. He had received nothing. It was like dropping a stone into a well and never hearing it hit the bottom. The silence unnerved him more than any threat could. He scanned the convoy of luxury cars gliding up the long gravel driveway. Everything was as it should be. The titans of industry, the political power brokers, the socialites, all the chess pieces of his world were arriving, paying tribute to the legacy he had so meticulously constructed. And then he saw it. It was a limousine, but it was different from the others. It wasn't the ostentatious black of the new money crowd. It was a deep, classic Rolls-Royce silver, a vehicle of old-world elegance and undeniable power. It moved with a serene, unhurried grace, parting the sea of lesser cars. It didn't proceed to the guest drop-off. It glided to a stop directly at the base of the grand staircase, a place reserved for no one. The orchestra faltered for a moment, a violin squeaking in surprise. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Julian's blood ran cold. He knew with a primal certainty that defied logic who was in that car. His security chief, a burly ex-Mossad agent, started to move, but Julian raised a single sharp hand. "Hold!" The chauffeur, dressed in a classic gray uniform, opened the rear door. The first to emerge was a boy of about 5, dressed in a flawless miniature tuxedo. He had a serious, watchful expression and Julian's own intense dark eyes. He stood poised by the open door. Then came a second boy, nearly identical, but with a spark of mischief in his smile. He bounced slightly on the balls of his feet, taking in the scene with wide-eyed wonder. Finally, a little girl stepped out, her hand holding her brother's. She was in a simple, elegant dress the color of a pale dawn, her hair in a neat braid. She looked up at the grand house not with awe, but with a calm, unnerving curiosity. They stood in a line, 3 perfect, impossible figures. The crowd fell into a stunned, absolute silence. They were Julian's face, his eyes, his jawline, mirrored 3 times. The math was simple, brutal, and undeniable. Then Ilara emerged. She was not the woman he had dismissed. That woman was a memory, soft and pliable. This woman was a queen. She wore a gown of deep emerald green, a color that spoke of life, of resilience, of old money and unbreakable will. Her hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, revealing the clean, strong lines of her neck and jaw. She wore no ostentatious jewels, only a simple, familiar gold locket. She was not there to scream or cause a scene. She was radiating a power so profound and self-contained, it made the glittering wealth around her look cheap and fragile. She took her children's hands. Together, the four of them began to ascend the stairs. Julian felt Serafina's hand tighten on his arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "Julian?" she hissed, her voice a thread of ice. "What is this?" He couldn't answer. His throat was closed. His carefully constructed world was fracturing, the sound of the cracking ice deafening in his ears. Every guest, every camera, every eye was on the silent, graceful procession coming up the stairs. Ilara stopped a few feet from them. She didn't look at Serafina. Her eyes, clear and steady, were locked on Julian. "Hello, Julian," she said, her voice even and calm, carrying easily in the silent air. "Liam, Noah, Chloe, this is your father." The three children looked at him. There was no accusation in their eyes, only a quiet, searching curiosity. It was worse than any hatred. It was the look of strangers assessing a curious relic. Julian felt the world tilt, the blood roaring in his ears. This was the attack he had been dreading, the public detonation of his past. He opened his mouth to call for security, to unleash his lawyers, to do something. But Ilara spoke again, her voice dropping lower, for his ears only. "This isn't about them, not really." She took a small step closer, the scent of her perfume, the same one she used to wear in the garage, jasmine and salt, cutting through the expensive air. "It's about him." "Him?" Julian croaked, his mind struggling to catch up. "Arthur," she said, and the name was a key turning a lock deep in his soul. "I know about the journals. I know about the workshop fire. I know about the prototype." It was a direct hit, not to his reputation, not to his wealth, but to the rotten core of his very identity. The lie he had lived with for 20 years, the secret that powered his every ambition and every fear, was now reflected in the eyes of the woman he had cast aside. He stared at her, his mask of command utterly shattered. He saw no triumph in her face, no vicious glee. He saw something far more terrifying: pity. She had not come to destroy his future. She had come to force him to face his past. The children were not the weapon, they were the jury. The real evidence was the truth she held in her gaze. "He didn't die a failed dreamer, Julian," she said softly, her voice filled with a sorrow that was somehow for him. "He died a father whose son stole his legacy, and you've spent your entire life building a bigger, shinier tombstone to hide the crime." Serafina, hearing the name Arthur, saw the color drain from Julian's face. She saw the terror, raw and primal, that replaced his usual cold authority. She had spent 5 years as the flawless face of his empire, but in that instant, she understood she knew nothing of the man himself. She was just another asset in a portfolio built on sand. Slowly, she withdrew her hand from his arm. The climax was not a shout, it was a whisper. It was the silent, devastating implosion of a man's soul, witnessed by the world he had fought so hard to impress. Ilara had not crashed his party. She had held up a mirror, and the reflection was that of a monster he could no longer pretend not to see. The silence on the grand staircase was a living entity. It pressed in on Julian, suffocating him. The orchestra was a distant, irrelevant memory. The hundreds of guests were statues in a wax museum of his own making. The only real things in the universe were Ilara's unwavering eyes and the 3 small, silent figures standing beside her. "Get them out of here!" Julian finally managed, the words tearing from his throat, raw and ragged. It was an instinct, the command of a king whose castle had been breached. He didn't look at Ilara. He looked at his security chief, whose face was a mask of confusion and alarm. But Ilara did not flinch. "We're not leaving," she said, her voice retaining its impossible calm. "Not yet." She took another step, closing the distance until she stood directly before him. She reached into the small, elegant clutch she carried and retrieved not a weapon, not a legal document, but a small, worn, leather-bound book. It was Arthur Thorne's journal. She didn't open it. She held it out to him. His legacy isn't the code in your servers, Julian. It's this. The story of the man you erased. Julian stared at the journal as if it were a venomous snake. Memories, black and tar-like, flooded him. His father's workshop, smelling of solder and hope. The look of betrayal in his father's eyes when Julian had called his life's work junk. The acrid smell of smoke on the night of the fire, a smell he had convinced himself was the scent of progress. "What do you want, Ilara?" he snarled, a cornered animal. "Money? You want more money? Name a price. Just take them and go." It was the wrong thing to say. For the first time, a flicker of genuine anger crossed her face. "Money?" she repeated, her voice laced with a contempt that cut deeper than any shout. "You think this is about money? I have your money. I have the gilded cage you locked me in. I am not here for your currency, Julian. I am here for your soul." From the corner of his eye, he saw Serafina take a deliberate step back. Her face was pale, her expression one of dawning horror. She wasn't looking at the children. She was looking at him, at the stranger he had just become in front of her. The visionary she had married was crumbling into a panicked, snarling brute. "You will not do this to me," he whispered, his voice shaking with a rage born of pure terror. "You will not destroy everything I've built." "You built nothing," Ilara countered, her voice dropping to an intense, piercing whisper. "You stole the foundation and have been terrified of a strong wind ever since. This entire life, this party, this house, this woman on your arm, it's all just a barricade against the ghost of your father. But the ghost is here now, Julian. He's standing right in front of you." He looked at Liam, at his serious, watchful eyes, so like Arthur's. He looked at the journal in Ilara's hand. The past and the present were colliding with the force of a particle accelerator, and he was at the epicenter. With a guttural cry, he lunged, not for Ilara, but for the journal. His hand shot out to snatch it, to destroy it, to hurl it into the darkness. But Liam, the quiet, watchful boy, moved. With a speed that was shocking in one so small, he stepped in front of his mother, placing his small body between her and Julian. He didn't cower. He stood his ground, his chin lifted, and stared up at his father with an expression of profound, adult-like disappointment. It was the look. The exact same look Arthur had given him in their final, terrible argument. Julian froze, his hand hovering in the air. The strength drained from his body. He wasn't just facing Ilara anymore. He was facing his father's ghost, embodied in the 5-year-old son he had never met. The cycle of his own sin was staring back at him. The spell was broken. The world came rushing back in a cacophony of gasps and frantic whispers from the crowd. Cameras, once discreetly documenting the party, were now brazenly flashing, capturing the tableau of ruin. The mogul, broken. The model, recoiling in disgust. The wronged wife, standing in quiet victory. And the 3 silent children who were the living proof of it all. Serafina had seen enough. The man she married was a carefully constructed fiction. The legacy she had bought into was a fraud. With a quiet, devastating finality, she turned and walked away. She didn't run. She moved with the deliberate grace of a woman extricating herself from a disaster, her white gown a retreating flag of surrender. She walked down the grand staircase through the stunned crowd and disappeared into the night. The queen had abdicated. Julian watched her go, but it barely registered. He was hollowed out, a shell. He lowered his hand, his shoulders slumping in utter defeat. Ilara did not press her advantage. She simply placed the journal into the hands of her son, Liam. "This belongs to our family," she said softly, her eyes still on Julian. Then she took her children's hands once more. "It's time to go home." She turned, and with the same unhurried dignity with which she had arrived, led her children back down the stairs. The crowd parted for them as if for royalty. They were a portrait of unbreakable grace in a landscape of glittering wreckage. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, Ilara paused and looked back at Julian, a solitary, pathetic figure standing amidst the ruins of his own party. She offered no parting shot, no final condemnation. Her expression was one of immense, tragic sadness. Then she turned, entered the waiting silver limousine, and was gone. The orchestra remained silent. The guests, unsure what to do, began to quietly disperse, melting back into the darkness, leaving Julian Thorne alone on the steps of his empty monument. the flashes of the lingering paparazzi like the last mocking flicker of a fire that had consumed everything. The climax of his life was not a triumph, but the deafening silence of a legacy exposed as a lie. The aftermath was a brutal public autopsy. The story was a supernova in the media, the images of Alara's regal arrival and Serafina's stark departure playing on a continuous loop. Thorne's triple secret, the empire of lies. The narrative Julian had spent 2 decades meticulously crafting was dismantled overnight. His company's stock plummeted. Board members convened emergency meetings. His kingdom, which had seemed so invincible, proved to be a house of cards. Julian did not fight it. He vanished. He retreated to the country estate, now a mausoleum of his hubris, and cut off all contact. He fired his public relations team, ignored the frantic calls from his lawyers, and locked the gates. For days, he wandered the empty, cavernous rooms, the faint scent of expensive flowers from the gala, now a cloying smell of decay. He drank. He didn't eat. He stared at his own reflection in the black mirrored surfaces of his modern furniture and saw a stranger. His rock bottom was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, grinding descent into the truth. The ghost Alara had spoken of was now his constant companion. The ghost of his father, Arthur. The ghost of the man he could have been. One night, in a fit of drunken despair, he stormed into his state-of-the-art home office, a room that had once been his command center, and began to destroy it. He swept billion-dollar contracts off his desk, smashed monitors, and tore books from their shelves. In his rampage, he uncovered something his staff had packed away from his old penthouse, a box of Alara's things they had been meaning to ship to her. On top of the box was a small, sealed package. With trembling hands, he opened it. Inside was Arthur's journal. Alara hadn't taken it with her. She had left it for him. It was not a weapon she had wielded. It was a key she had offered. He sat on the floor amidst the wreckage of his office, the journal in his lap. And for the first time in his adult life, he read his father's words. He read through the night, the rising sun casting long shadows across the room. He read about his father's hopes, his frustrations, his brilliant, gentle mind at work. He read the passages about himself, the ones filled with love and a growing, terrible fear. He saw his own youthful arrogance, his cruel ambition, through his father's pained, loving eyes. He did not find an accusation in those pages. He found a eulogy, for a relationship he had murdered, for a man he had never allowed himself to know, and for the son he had failed to be. When he finished the last page, Julian Thorne finally broke. He curled up on the cold floor, clutching his father's journal to his chest, and sobbed. It wasn't the cathartic weeping of the man in the garage. It was the racking, soul-tearing grief of a man mourning his own soul. His transformation was not a lightning strike of revelation. It was a slow, painful, and quiet process, marked not by grand gestures, but by small, consistent acts of atonement. His first action was invisible to the world. He used a shell corporation to establish a foundation, the Arthur Initiative. Its mission was simple: to provide grants to overlooked independent inventors and creators, the failed dreamers of the world. He funded it with a significant portion of his personal, non-corporate wealth. It was anonymous, uncelebrated work. It was penance. His second action was to write a letter, not to the board, not to the press, but to Alara. He didn't use a computer or have an assistant type it. He wrote it by hand on simple, plain paper. It took him a week to write the first one. It wasn't an apology. He knew the word was meaningless. It wasn't an excuse. It was a confession. "I've been reading his journals," he wrote. "I never knew him. I saw him as an obstacle to my own ambition, an embarrassment. I realize now that my entire life has been a frantic effort to prove him wrong, and in doing so, I became a grotesque parody of the success I thought I wanted. I didn't just steal his work, I stole his memory. I don't know what to do with that truth, other than to finally admit that it is the truth." He sent it via a simple postal service, with no expectation of a reply. He wrote another a week later, and another the week after that. They were reflections, fragments of a man dismantling his own lies, piece by painful piece. He wrote about his fear of failure, a fear he now understood was a projection of how he had viewed his father. He wrote about the hollowness of his life with Serafina, a relationship built on brand synergy instead of human connection. Ilara read every letter. She did not reply. She simply watched and she waited. His third and most terrifying action was to reach out about the children. He didn't send a lawyer demanding visitation. He sent a short, handwritten note to Ilara. "I know I have no right to ask this, but would you be willing to send me a recent photograph of them? I want to see their faces." Ilara sent back a single school photograph. Liam, Noah, and Chloe smiling, their personalities shining through. Julian placed it on the desk in his now repaired office, next to an old, faded picture of his father he had found in the journal. His two legacies, one he had created and abandoned, the other he had destroyed and mourned. Slowly, carefully, a fragile line of communication began to open, arbitrated entirely by Ilara. Julian's actions were always tentative, always respectful of her authority as their mother. He asked about their interests. Ilara told him Chloe was a budding artist, Noah was obsessed with building elaborate Lego cities, and Liam was a quiet reader, a lover of science. For Liam's 6th birthday, Julian didn't send an expensive toy. He sent a first-edition copy of a book on astrophysics for children, along with a note. "Your grandfather loved to look at the stars. He believed they held all the answers. Maybe you'll find some of your own." He started attending their school events, but always on Ilara's terms. He didn't arrive in a flashy car. He drove a simple sedan and parked down the street. He sat in the very back of the auditorium for the school play, a solitary figure watching his daughter Chloe paint a backdrop on stage. He didn't approach them. He just watched, a ghost content to remain in the shadows, simply bearing witness to the lives he had created. He was learning that being a father was not about possession or control, but about presence, even a distant, repentant presence. His redemption was not a destination. It was a long, arduous road, walked one quiet, emotionally intelligent step at a time. He was not trying to win back his family. He was trying, for the first time, to become a man worthy of having one. 2 years passed. 2 years of quiet letters, distant observation, and the slow, arduous work of dismantling an empire built on a lie. Julian had methodically extricated himself from the day-to-day operations of Thorn Industries, ceding control to a new CEO and a revamped board. He poured his energy and his remaining fortune into the Arthur Initiative, which was quietly changing the lives of dozens of creators. He had, in a sense, become his father's posthumous partner. His relationship with his children had evolved from non-existent to a fragile, tentative connection. He had graduated from sitting in the back of auditoriums to supervised visits in a public park, always with Ilara present, a watchful but no longer hostile guardian. He learned that Noah had his own boisterous laugh, that Chloe had a fierce, protective love for her brothers, and that Liam possessed a quiet, unnerving intelligence that saw right through any pretense. He never tried to buy their affection. He learned to listen. He learned to be present. It was a fragile piece, an ecosystem of healing that was about to be subjected to the ultimate stress test. A rival tech conglomerate, a company run by a man whose ruthlessness mirrored Julian's own former self, had been digging. They had found a disgruntled former associate of Arthur Thorn, a man who knew the truth about the workshop fire and the stolen prototype. An exposé was imminent. Not a tabloid piece, but a meticulously documented investigation that would be presented to the Patent Office and the SEC. It was a corporate kill shot, designed to invalidate Thorn Industries' core patents and send the company into a death spiral. Julian's lawyers, the old guard who had helped him build his fortress, descended on the estate. The solution they presented was as brilliant as it was monstrous. They had dug into Arthur Thorn's life. They found evidence of his financial struggles, his occasional bouts with depression. They could build a narrative. They would paint Arthur as an unstable, incompetent tinkerer who was bitter about his son's success. They would preemptively discredit him, portraying him as a charlatan whose claims were the ramblings of a failed and troubled man. They could protect the company, protect the shareholders, protect what was left of the Thorn name. All Julian had to do was sign off on the strategy. All he had to do was destroy his father a second time, He sat in his cavernous boardroom, the same room where he had once plotted market takeovers and listened to their plan. The lawyers were confident, their voices sharp and clinical. This was war, and truth was the first casualty. As they spoke, Julian looked at the far end of the table where Alara sat. He had asked her to be there, not as his ex-wife, but as the executor of his conscience. She had said nothing, her hands resting calmly on the polished table, her gaze fixed on him. This was the test. Everything he had done for the past 2 years, the foundation, the letters, the quiet presence in his children's lives, it all led to this moment. Was his transformation real, or was it just another more sophisticated form of crisis management? In the end, when the chips were down, would he choose the money or the memory? The lie that sustained an empire or the truth that honored a father? He thought of Liam and the first edition book on astrophysics. He thought of his father's journal, of the love and fear in those elegant, looping words. He thought of what it would mean to stand on his father's grave and call him a liar to save a company that was already a monument to his own sins. "No," Julian said, his voice quiet but absolute. The lead lawyer stopped mid-sentence. "No, Julian, you're not understanding the stakes." "I understand the stakes perfectly," Julian interrupted, his eyes meeting Alara's across the long table. "For the first time in my life, I actually do." He stood up. "There will be no smear campaign. We will not be issuing a denial." He took a deep breath. "We will be issuing a press release, a full and complete confession, and we will be holding a press conference. I will be the one to tell the world that the foundation of this company was built on the work of my father, Arthur Thorne, a brilliant man I wronged in every conceivable way." The lawyers stared at him aghast. It was corporate suicide. It was financial immolation. "You're going to lose everything," his oldest legal counsel said, his voice a horrified whisper. Julian looked at Alara, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of something beyond pity or sadness in her eyes. It was respect. "I already lost everything that mattered a long time ago," Julian said. "I'm just starting to try and earn some of it back." The press conference was a global event. Julian Thorne, the fallen titan, stood at a simple podium, not in a suit, but in a simple shirt and trousers. He looked older, tired, but the haunted, paranoid look in his eyes was gone. It was replaced by a calm, settled clarity. He told the whole story. He didn't spare himself. He detailed his youthful greed, his callous dismissal of his father's genius, and the lie he had perpetuated for 2 decades. He announced that Thorne Industries would be voluntarily opening its patents and creating a public trust, with a significant percentage of all future profits to be funneled directly into the Arthur Initiative, ensuring that the legacy would now belong to all creators. He concluded by announcing his permanent resignation from any and all roles associated with the company. He was letting it go, all of it. He walked off that stage with nothing but the clothes on his back, and the truth he had finally chosen to carry. He had been given a choice between his father's memory and his father's stolen empire. He chose his father. It was the final, most profound act of his redemption, a public sacrifice that proved his transformation was not for show, but for the soul. 5 years later, the autumn sun cast a long, golden light across a small, tidy workshop that smelled of sawdust, metal, and brewing coffee. The space was filled not with corporate logos and sleek monitors, but with half-finished inventions, blueprints spread across wooden tables and tools that were worn and well used. It was a place of quiet, joyful creation. It was Arthur Thorne's dream, reborn. Julian, now a man whose face was etched with the lines of someone who had lived and learned, looked up from the intricate clockwork mechanism he was tinkering with as Alara walked in. She carried a basket filled with apples, her expression serene and content. Their relationship had found a new, unwritten definition. It was not a rekindled romance. The scars of the past were too deep for that. It was something quieter, more profound. A partnership in parenting, a friendship forged in the fires of truth and forgiveness, not a spoken forgiveness, but one that was lived day by day. Thorne Industries had survived, transformed. It was a smaller, more ethical company now, known more for its philanthropic trust than its market dominance. The name Thorne was no longer synonymous with ruthless ambition, but with a strange public story of downfall and atonement. The children, now vibrant, intelligent teenagers, were thriving. They had a father, not the distant, mythical mogul, but the man who came to their soccer games, who helped Chloe build the sets for her high school plays, and who spent hours in this very workshop with Liam, debating physics and building small, wondrous machines. He had finally learned that a legacy wasn't an empire to be defended, but a connection to be nurtured. Noah forgot his calculus textbook, Alara said, placing the basket on a clear corner of a workbench. Again. Julian chuckled, a warm, easy sound. The boy has a mind for chaos theory. The orderly world of calculus can't contain him. He wiped his hands on a rag. I'll run it over to the school. As he prepared to leave, Alara picked up a small framed photo from his desk. It was the school picture he had requested all those years ago. Next to it was the faded photo of his father. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Losing it all?" Julian paused at the door, looking back at the workshop, at the gentle hum of his small, meaningful life. He thought of the glass tower, the suffocating weight of the lies, the constant gnawing fear. He looked at Alara, the woman who had not destroyed him, but had, in her own powerful way, saved him by forcing him to save himself. "Alara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer hid. "I didn't lose anything that was ever truly mine, and I gained this." His gesture encompassed the workshop, the quiet peace, the unspoken understanding between them, the love for the children he was finally, truly, a father to. He didn't need her to say, "I forgive you." Her presence here, in this workshop built on the foundation of his father's honored memory, was forgiveness enough. It was an acknowledgement that he had become the man Arthur had always hoped he would be, the man she had once believed in back in the garage. She smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Go on," she said. "Your son is waiting." He nodded, and as he walked out into the crisp autumn air, he felt not the weight of a fallen empire, but the lightness of a man who had finally found his true inheritance. It wasn't in a stock portfolio or a brand name. It was in the simple, profound act of being present, of living in the truth, and of knowing that the most valuable legacy you can ever leave is the love you were brave enough to earn. The story lingered, not as a drama of wealth and revenge, but as a quiet, resonant lesson that a soul, no matter how lost, can always find its way home, not by building higher walls, but by finally having the courage to tear them down.